In the summer of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd lad who had lost one of his goats climbed up a cliff overlooking the Dead Sea and stumbled into a cave full of ancient scrolls. These were the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, the library of a religious community that lived there some 2,000 years earlier. Many scholars identify them as a sect known as the Essenes. There remains debate about this, but whatever the exact identity of the Dead Sea sectarians, they clearly disapproved of the religious practices going on in Jerusalem and withdrew to the desert of Judea. Their religious leader, known in the scrolls themselves as the teacher of righteousness, may have been executed or murdered in some way, all the more adding to the mystery. As for the practices of the Essenes, assuming they were, in fact, the authors of the scrolls, they bear a remarkable resemblance to those of the early Nazarene community as it developed in the decades after the life of Jesus, Yeshua. They lived a communal life and shared their possessions. Their communal meals seemed to foreshadow the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist. They appear to have believed not only in one Messiah, but two. They practiced ritual immersion and believed that the apocalypse was imminent. There were, in fact, a number of Essene communities scattered through Judea and the Galilee. Josephus writes this: "When I speak of the Essenes, I do so from considerable knowledge. About age 14, I won universal acclaim for my love of letters, so much so that the chief priests and the city leaders regularly came to me for exact information on some particulars in our laws. 2 years later, I began studying the principal Jewish sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, favoring the last when I lived for 3 years in the wilderness as a disciple of a hermit named Banos. But I abandoned such austerity at age 19 when I returned to Jerusalem to join the Pharisees." Josephus goes on to observe, "As for the Essenes, they believe in the immortality of the soul and strive for righteousness, but they use a different ritual of purification for their sacrifices, and so are barred from the temple sanctuary. The 4,000 in this sect hold their property in common, and do not bring wives or slaves into the community, but live off by themselves. Always dressed in white, they do not change their clothes until they are worn threadbare. They deem oil defiling and purify themselves in cold water. A candidate joins their order only after a 3-year probation, and they are also extraordinarily interested in ancient writings. So strictly do they observe the Sabbath that they will not even relieve themselves on that day. They contemn the miseries of life and are above pain by the generosity of their mind. As for death, if it will be for their glory, they esteem it better than living always. And indeed, our war with the Romans gave abundant evidence what great souls they had in their trials, wherein, although they were tortured and distorted, burnt and torn to pieces, and went through all kinds of instruments of torment, and they were racked, twisted, burned, and broken, but nonetheless smiled in their very pains and laughed to those who scorned them and inflicted the torments upon them. And Pliny the Elder has this to say: to the west of the Dead Sea, the Essenes have put the necessary distance between themselves and the insalubrious shore. They're a people unique of its kind, and admirable beyond all others in the whole world, without women and renouncing love entirely, without money and having for company only palm trees. Owing to the throng of newcomers, this people is daily reborn in equal number. Indeed, those whom, wearied by the fluctuations of fortune, life leads to adopt their customs, stream to them in great numbers. Thus, unbelievable though this may seem, for thousands of centuries, a people has existed which is eternal, yet into which no one is born. So fruitful for them is the repentance which others feel for their past lives. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for their part, have given us a detailed portrait of these so-called sons of light, who developed their own peculiar religious and social institutions. There can be little doubt that there was some relationship between them and John the Baptist. But what about the man called Yeshua, whom history knows as Jesus of Nazareth? We have to be very cautious about concluding that Yeshua had anything to do with the Essenes, even though some fancy that he might have been part of their community at some point. In fact, he seems to have harbored a good deal of animosity toward them. By and large, Yeshua, like the majority of Israel, leaned toward the world of the Jewish sages, who in turn were linked to the Pharisee movement. Yeshua grew up in a home which was probably steeped in learning, and he probably studied with men who were close to the sages. Yeshua must have had enough contact with the Essenes to know what they stood for, but most of the time he distanced himself from their worldview. It's a good bet that he encountered the Essenes through John the Baptist, and he appears to have made direct reference to them via the term they used to describe themselves, the sons of light. From a parable recorded in Luke 16, we understand that these sons of light had not only secluded themselves from the rest of Israel, but rejected any financial undertakings with those who did not belong to their sect. Yeshua takes just the opposite approach. He's accused of being a wine-bibber and a gluttonous man. He hangs around with publicans and sinners, not to mention women of questionable virtue, such as Mary Magdalene. He seems to slap the Dead Sea sectarians in the face when he declares, "For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the sons of light." Unfortunately, since we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls during the past 2,000 years, nobody knew the identity of these sons of light. Now we know. Another example of Yeshua's attitude is found in his statement, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." It was assumed down through the ages that Yeshua was referring either to the Hebrew Bible or the teachings of the sages. And such assumptions helped give rise to the phenomenon of Christian anti-Semitism, the charge that Jews are hateful and unforgiving and that Jewish law somehow commands the hatred of others. But where do we find such a statement as "hate your enemy" in either the Hebrew Scriptures or rabbinic literature? Nowhere. But we now read in the Dead Sea Scrolls that one is commanded
לאהוב כל בני אור, איש כגורלו, בעצת אל, ולשנוא כל בני חושך, איש כאשמתו, בנקמת אל.
The Essenes, assuming they wrote the scrolls, had actually elevated hatred to a religious duty. Their worldview was so exclusive that everyone, even fellow Israelites who were not members of their community, were considered sons of darkness and therefore enemies. Yeshua cleverly inverts their command and contemptuously throws it back at them. Far from being at odds with rabbinic Judaism, as anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic commentators have for centuries depicted him, Yeshua's real quarrel was with the Dead Sea sect and the rigid exclusivism they fostered. The war of words between Yeshua and the Essenes may even be seen in the details of the Christian sacrament known as the Lord's Supper, the Communion. Known as the Holy Eucharist, it involves the taking of bread and wine in that order. As indicated in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, we find exactly this tradition in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the same order.
והיה כי יערוכו השולחן לאכול, או התירוש לשתות. הכהן ישלח ידו לראשונה, להיברך בראשית הלחם, או התירוש לשתות.
But a careful reading of Luke's Gospel depicts Yeshua following not Essene tradition, but that of the sages, as practiced in Jewish homes to this day, taking the cup of wine first, then the bread.
And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he said, "Take this and share it among yourselves." And when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them. Luke 22:17-19.
And literary critics wonder what's going on in these accounts. Well, consider what the real founder of Christian theology, not Yeshua, but Paul, wrote decades later.
For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." 1 Corinthians 11:23-25.
Paul has Yeshua following the Essene order, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Bread first, then wine. Could it be that Luke's Gospel is true to the tradition Yeshua would have followed, while the later editors of Mark and Matthew, themselves living decades later, were influenced by Paul and wrote their Gospel accounts to match the way Paul had worded things? And that brings us to a serious scholarly question. In the years following Yeshua's crucifixion, was there a second wave of the Nazarene movement, profoundly influenced by the thinking, traditions, and behavior of the Dead Sea sect? While we've already shown that Yeshua had little positive to say about the Essenes, the later New Testament writings often pick up thought and language almost verbatim from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book of Acts, for example, describes the communal living practiced by the Nazarenes in a manner reminiscent of the Essenes.
They began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts,
Acts 2, 45 to 46. And the whole concept of exclusivism, the idea that all of humanity is doomed save for the chosen few, the sons of light, sounds a lot like the general tone of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then, let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. 1 Thessalonians 5, 5 to 6.
Or consider the very end of the Gospel of Mark, almost certainly added later by an editorial hand. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved, but he who does not believe shall be damned. Eventually, Christianity would adopt the theology of supersessionism, that the new covenant of Jesus, Yeshua, had replaced the old, so that the new people of God are the Christians, while the Jews are blind, lost, and without hope. How much of Orthodox Christian theology should be considered anti-Jewish, even, let's face it, anti-Semitic? And how much of that theology may have resulted, even indirectly, from the influence of the Dead Sea Scrolls? These are serious questions when considering Jewish-Christian relations to this day. Consider also the Christian theology of original sin, the idea that people are born utterly depraved from birth. It's a concept completely absent in Rabbinic Judaism, which declares that people are born neutral, with two natures, a good inclination and an evil inclination, and that we must choose between them. The Dead Sea Scrolls offer two explanations of sin. One was based on the story of Genesis 6, involving sexual relations between the sons of God and the daughters of men. This union, it was believed, produced superhuman beings who were later interpreted as evil spirits, responsible for sin in the world. The second explanation involves a commentary on Genesis 1.
ביד שר אורים ממשלת כל בני צדק, בדרכי אור יתהלכו, וביד מלאך חושך כל ממשלת בני אבל, ובדרכי חושך יתהלכו, ובמלאך חושך תאוות כל בני צדק, וכל חטאותם ועוונותם ואשמתם, ופשעי מעשיהם בממשלתו.
The text is clear. God created two spirits for human beings, one of truth and light, the other of injustice and darkness. Both spirits have superhuman qualities and powers that play out in the conflict between good and evil. Where did the spirit of evil, the spirit of injustice and darkness come from? Well, God created it. Humans have qualities from both spirits because God gave both spirits to them. In other words, a dualism was instituted by God as part of creation itself. What do we make of all this? Was there really a second wave of ancient Nazarene movement that embraced the dualism of the Essenes, even while Yeshua himself had little use for the Dead Sea sect or its dualism, even disparaging them? In the marketplace of ideas, everything is up for grabs.